before the pyramids rise above the desert horizon, before the names of kings are carved into stone, before even the idea of Egypt exists as a unified civilization. There is only darkness, not the kind of darkness that comes with nightfall, not the absence of sunlight, but something deeper, something infinite, an endless silent expanse without shape, without time, without boundary. In Egyptian mythology, this is Nun, the primordial waters of chaos, not water as humans understand it, but a boundless, formless existence that contains everything and nothing at once. There is no sky, no earth, no horizon, no life, only potential. And from that potential, something extraordinary happens. Creation begins, not through conflict, not through explosion, but through emergence. From the stillness of Nun, a single presence rises, Atum. Self-created, self-sustaining, a being who brings himself into existence through will alone. In a universe without ground, Atum creates the first point of stability. He rises upon a primordial mound, the first piece of solid existence to break the infinite waters. This moment is not just creation, it is separation. Order from chaos, form from formlessness. This is the beginning of everything. But Atum is alone. And in Egyptian mythology, existence cannot remain singular. Creation must expand, must multiply, must generate complexity. So Atum creates the first gods, not through external tools, not through materials, but from himself. He produces Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Together they represent the first duality, dry and wet, separation and connection, breath and substance. With them, the universe begins to take shape. Shu lifts the sky away from the earth. Tefnut brings balance to the emerging world. And from their union come Jeb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. Now the universe has structure, above and below, heaven and ground, and between them space for life. But even this is not enough, because creation in Egyptian mythology is not a single event. It is a process, a layering of existence that builds outward generation by generation. Jeb and Nut produce 4 more deities: Osiris, Isis, Zed, and Nephthys. With them, mythology begins to shift from pure cosmology into narrative. Because these are not just forces of nature. They are personalities. They have relationships, conflicts, motivations. And through them, the universe becomes not just structured, but alive with meaning. At this stage, Egyptian mythology does something unique. It does not insist on one version of creation. While the Heliopolitan tradition centers on Atum and this lineage of gods, other regions develop their own explanations. In Memphis, creation is attributed to Ptah, a god who brings the world into existence through thought and speech. In Hermopolis, creation begins with a group of 8 primordial deities representing different aspects of chaos. These systems do not replace each other. They coexist, because Egyptian mythology is not concerned with contradiction. It is concerned with completeness. Different regions emphasize different aspects of reality, and together they form a layered understanding of existence. This flexibility allows the mythology to grow alongside Egyptian civilization. As political power shifts, as cities rise and fall, as rulers assert dominance, the importance of certain gods changes. But the underlying framework remains intact. Chaos gives way to order. Order must be maintained. And the gods are responsible for sustaining that balance. This idea becomes central to everything that follows. It is not enough for the universe to be created. It must be kept stable, because chaos never disappears. None still exists, surrounding the ordered world, pressing against it. And if balance is lost, chaos will return. This is where the concept of Mayat emerges more clearly. Mayat is not just a principle. It is the foundation of existence. Truth, balance, order, justice, the proper functioning of the universe. Everything from the movement of the sun to the behavior of humans must align with Mayat. And maintaining Mayat becomes the responsibility of both gods and humans, especially the king. From the earliest stages of Egyptian civilization, rulers are not seen as separate from mythology. They are part of it. The pharaoh is not just a political leader. He is a divine figure, a living link between the gods and the human world. His role is to maintain order, to ensure that the cycles of nature continue, that the Nile floods as it should, that the sun rises each day, that the boundary between chaos and order remains intact. This belief transforms governance into something sacred. Political authority becomes cosmic responsibility. And failure is not just a loss of power, it is a disruption of the universe itself. As Egyptian society develops, these ideas become embedded in every aspect of life. Temples are built not just as places of worship, but as centers of cosmic maintenance. Rituals are performed daily to sustain the gods. Offerings are made to ensure balance. Priests act as intermediaries, maintaining the connection between the visible world and the unseen forces that govern it. But among all the gods, one begins to rise in importance above the others. Ra, the sun god. In a land defined by the rhythm of the Nile and the certainty of the sun's daily journey, Ra becomes the most visible expression of cosmic order. Each day, he travels across the sky in his solar bark, bringing light to the world. Each night, he descends into the underworld, battling the forces of chaos to ensure that dawn will come again. This cycle is not guaranteed. It is a struggle, a constant reaffirmation of order against the ever-present threat of disorder. And in this struggle, the entire universe is involved. Because if Ra fails, everything ends. This idea reinforces the importance of balance at every level of existence. From the gods to the king to ordinary people, everyone has a role to play in maintaining Mayat. Even actions in daily life, honesty, fairness, respect, are seen as contributions to cosmic stability. And so mythology is not separate from reality. It is reality. It explains the world, guides behavior, defines identity, and connects the present to something eternal. As Egypt moves toward the Old Kingdom, these beliefs become more formalized. The gods are depicted in consistent forms. Their stories become more detailed, their relationships more defined, and the connection between mythology and state power becomes inseparable. The pyramids begin to rise, not just as tombs, but as statements, monuments to the idea that death is not the end, that order continues beyond life, that the king, as a divine figure, will ascend to join the gods. But for that to happen, the journey after death must be understood. It must be navigated, and it must be secured. Because just as the universe emerged from chaos, so too does every human life risk returning to it. And this is where Egyptian mythology expands into its next great dimension. The afterlife, the judgment of the soul, and the promise of eternity As Egyptian mythology evolves beyond the origins of creation, it begins to confront a question that defines every civilization. What happens after death? For early Egyptians, death is not an abstract concept. It is immediate, visible, unavoidable. Bodies decay, voices disappear. Life once vibrant becomes still. And yet the world continues. The sun still rises. The Nile still floods. The order of existence does not collapse when a single life ends. So death within this framework cannot simply be an ending. It must be part of a larger system, a transition rather than a conclusion. And it is through the story of Osiris that Egyptian mythology gives its most powerful answer. Osiris is not just a god. He is a king, a ruler of Egypt in a mythic time before recorded history, when gods and humans exist in closer proximity and divine authority shapes the world directly. Under Osiris, the land prospers. He brings order, agriculture, and civilization to humanity. He teaches people how to grow crops, how to live in harmony with the rhythms of the Nile, and how to align their lives with the principle of Ma'at. In many ways, Osiris represents the ideal ruler. Not a conqueror, not a destroyer, but a bringer of balance. And because of this, he is loved, respected, trusted. But within Egyptian mythology, balance is never uncontested. Because where there is order, there is always the possibility of disruption. And that disruption takes form in Set. Set is Osiris's brother. But unlike Osiris, he represents chaos. Not chaos in the sense of pure destruction, but chaos as unpredictability, violence, instability, the breaking of order. Set is associated with deserts, storms, and the harsh forces of nature that exist beyond the fertile boundaries of the Nile. He is not purely evil, but he is dangerous, because he embodies the forces that Ma'at is meant to contain. And within this mythic framework, the tension between Osiris and Set becomes inevitable. According to the most well-known version of the story, Set becomes jealous of Osiris's power and influence, jealous of his rule, jealous of his connection to the people. And so he devises a plan. Not a direct confrontation, not a battle, but something more calculated, more controlled. He creates a beautifully crafted chest designed to perfectly fit Osiris's body. He presents it as a gift during a gathering, proposing that whoever fits inside it perfectly may keep it. One by one, others attempt. None succeed, until Osiris lies down inside. And in that moment, Set acts. The chest is sealed, locked, and thrown into the Nile. Osiris is gone, not defeated in battle, but removed, eliminated through deception. This moment is crucial, because it introduces something new into Egyptian mythology. The idea that even divine order can be disrupted. That Ma'at is not permanent. It must be maintained. And when it fails, consequences follow. The death of Osiris is not just the loss of a ruler. It is the breakdown of cosmic balance. And the world reacts. But the story does not end there. Because Egyptian mythology is not about final endings. It is about restoration. And restoration comes through Isis. Isis, the wife of Osiris, is one of the most powerful figures in Egyptian mythology. She represents loyalty, magic, intelligence, and the ability to navigate between life and death. When Osiris is lost, Isis does not accept it as final. She searches across lands, and waters, through uncertainty and danger, until she finds the chest containing his body. But even then, the restoration is not simple. In many versions of the myth, Set discovers the body again and destroys it, scattering its pieces across the land. This act deepens the disruption. It transforms death into fragmentation, into disintegration. But Isis persists. Piece by piece, she gathers the remains of Osiris, reconstructs him, and through powerful ritual and magic, brings him back, if only briefly. Not to life in the human world, but to a new form of existence. Because Osiris does not return as a king of the living. He becomes something else entirely. The ruler of the underworld, the lord of the afterlife. This transformation changes everything. Before Osiris, death is uncertain, undefined. But through his story, it becomes structured, organized, governed. The afterlife is no longer a mystery. It is a realm, with rules, with judgment, with possibility. Osiris becomes the first to pass through death and emerge into a new form of existence. And in doing so, he creates a path for others to follow. But this path is not automatic. It must be earned. Because in Egyptian belief, survival after death depends on alignment with Maat. This is where the concept of judgment enters mythology. After death, the soul does not simply continue. It is evaluated, measured, tested. At the center of this process is the weighing of the heart. The heart in Egyptian belief is not just an organ. It is the seat of thought, emotion, and identity. It contains everything a person has done in life. And it cannot lie. In the afterlife, the heart is placed on a scale. On one side, the heart. On the other, the feather of Maat. If the heart is lighter than the feather, the individual is found worthy. They may enter the afterlife, continue existence, join the realm governed by Osiris. But if the heart is heavier, if it is burdened by wrongdoing, imbalance, or failure to live in accordance with Maat, then it is consumed, destroyed. The soul ceases to exist. This concept introduces a powerful moral structure into Egyptian mythology. Life is no longer just about survival. It is about alignment. Every action matters, not because of immediate consequences, but because of what it means for eternity. This belief shapes behavior, guides society, and reinforces the importance of order at every level of existence. At the same time, the story of Osiris does something even more profound. It connects death with renewal. Osiris is associated not only with the afterlife, but with agriculture, with the cycles of the Nile, with the idea that life emerges from death. Just as crops grow from buried seeds, just as the Nile floods and recedes, just as the sun disappears and returns, so too does existence continue beyond apparent endings. This cyclical understanding becomes central to Egyptian thought. Death is not a break in the system. It is part of it. And this idea influences everything that follows. Burial practices become more elaborate. Tombs are constructed with increasing precision. Texts are developed to guide the dead through the afterlife. Spells, instructions, protections, all designed to ensure safe passage through the journey that Osiris first navigated. This is where mythology becomes practical. It is not just a story. It is a guide, a system for surviving death itself. And as Egyptian civilization continues to grow, these beliefs become more deeply integrated into its structure. The king is no longer just a living god. He is also a future Osiris, destined to die, be judged, and continue in the afterlife. The pyramids, once symbols of power, become gateways, tools for transition, ensuring that the ruler can move from the world of the living to the realm of the divine. But this privilege does not remain exclusive. Over time, the concept of the afterlife expands. It becomes accessible not only to kings, but to others. The path that Osiris opened is widened, and Egyptian mythology evolves to accommodate this change. Because as society becomes more complex, so too must its understanding of eternity. And with that evolution comes new gods, new journeys, and new challenges that define what it truly means to live and to endure beyond death. While the story of Osiris defines what happens after death, another force in Egyptian mythology governs something even more immediate. Something seen every day, felt by every living being. Something so constant that it becomes easy to forget how fragile it truly is. The sun. Each morning it rises. Each evening it disappears. And for the people of ancient Egypt, this was not just a natural cycle. It was a struggle, a victory repeated every single day. At the center of this cycle stands Ra, the sun god, one of the most powerful and enduring deities in Egyptian mythology. Ra is not simply the sun itself. He is the force behind it, the being who travels across the sky in a solar bark, bringing light, warmth, and life to the world. During the day, Ra sails across the heavens. The sky becomes a river, the sun his vessel, and as he moves from horizon to horizon, he illuminates the world, sustaining everything that exists within it. But this journey is not effortless. It is not passive, because every night, Ra must leave the visible world. He must descend into the duat, the underworld. And there, in the darkness beyond human sight, the true nature of existence is revealed. Because the night is not rest. It is conflict. As Ra travels through the duat, he faces the forces of chaos directly. And at the center of those forces is a being known as Apep. Apep is not like the other gods. He does not represent a balanced force within the system. He represents pure chaos, disorder, the undoing of creation itself. If Ra is the embodiment of order, of light, of continuity, then Apep is the opposite, a vast serpentine presence that seeks to stop the sun's journey, to swallow it, to prevent its return. Every night, the universe is at risk, because if Ra fails, the sun will not rise, and if the sun does not rise, Mayat collapses. The world ends. This belief transforms the daily cycle into something far more significant. Dawn is not just the beginning of a new day. It is proof of victory. Proof that order has once again overcome chaos. Proof that existence continues. And this struggle is not fought by Ra alone. He is accompanied by other deities, protectors, and forces aligned with Maat. Together, they defend the solar bark as it moves through the darkness. They repel Apep. They maintain the path. They ensure that the cycle is completed. This idea reinforces one of the most important principles in Egyptian mythology. Order is not permanent. It must be maintained continuously, relentlessly, at every level of existence. Even the most powerful god is not exempt from this responsibility. Even Ra must fight to preserve the world. As Egyptian civilization develops, Ra's importance grows. He becomes not just a god, but the central figure in many theological systems. In some traditions, he merges with other deities. Amun-Ra, for example, combines the hidden, universal power of Amun with the visible, life-giving force of Ra. This fusion reflects the evolving nature of Egyptian belief. Gods are not fixed. They adapt, combine, expand, reflecting the needs and perspectives of the society that worships them. Ra is also deeply connected to kingship. The pharaoh is seen as the son of Ra, a living extension of divine authority on earth. This connection reinforces the idea that maintaining order is not just a cosmic responsibility, it is a political one. The king must uphold Ma'at, must ensure that the balance maintained by the gods is reflected in human society. Because if disorder emerges in the human world, it echoes into the cosmic one, and vice versa. This interconnection between divine and human order becomes one of the defining features of Egyptian civilization. But Ra's journey also introduces something else, a sense of vulnerability. Because despite his power, despite his central role in sustaining existence, Ra is not invincible. He must struggle. He must rely on others. He must repeat the same journey every single day. This repetition is not weakness. It is necessity. Because creation is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing process. And every sunrise is a renewal of that process. At the same time, Egyptian mythology begins to explore the nature of divine power more deeply. Gods are not distant. They are involved. They experience conflict, transformation, even aging in some interpretations of Ra's later myths. This makes them more than abstract forces. It makes them participants in a dynamic system of existence. And this dynamic nature allows mythology to evolve alongside society. As new political centers rise, new interpretations of the gods emerge. Different regions emphasize different aspects of Ra's identity. Some focus on his role as creator, others on his role as ruler, others still on his nightly journey through the duat. But all share the same core understanding. The sun's movement is not guaranteed. It is earned every single day. This belief also shapes how Egyptians understand their own role in the universe. They are not passive observers. They are participants. Through rituals, offerings, and adherence to Ma'at, they contribute to the maintenance of order. Temples become centers of this activity. Priests perform daily ceremonies to support the gods, to reinforce the balance of the cosmos, to ensure that the cycle continues uninterrupted. Even ordinary actions, honesty, fairness, respect, are seen as contributions to this balance. Because Ma'at is not just cosmic, it is personal. And in this system, everything is connected. The sun's journey, the king's rule, the individual's behavior, all part of the same structure, all contributing to the same outcome, the continuation of existence itself. But as mythology continues to expand, it begins to explore not just the maintenance of order, but the consequences of its disruption. Because while Ra fights chaos every night, there are moments when chaos enters the human world more directly. Moments when balance is broken, when conflict emerges among the gods themselves. And these conflicts shape the next stage of Egyptian mythology, introducing new narratives, new struggles, and new interpretations of what it means to maintain order in a world where chaos is never fully gone. Because even with the sun rising each day, even with Ra victorious each morning. The threat of disorder remains, waiting, testing, and shaping the stories that define the relationship between gods, humans, and the fragile balance that holds everything together. If the story of Osiris explains death, and the journey of Ra explains the survival of the cosmos, then the conflict between Horus and Set explains something even closer to human experience: power, legitimacy, and the right to rule. Because Egyptian mythology is not only concerned with the structure of the universe, it is deeply concerned with who has the authority to maintain that structure, and what happens when that authority is challenged. The death of Osiris leaves a void, not only in the afterlife, where he becomes ruler of the dead, but in the world of the living. Because Egypt, both as a mythic and symbolic entity, now lacks its rightful king. And in that absence, conflict becomes inevitable. Set, who orchestrated Osiris's death, does not disappear after his act. He remains powerful, present, and, in his own view, justified. From one perspective, Set represents chaos, but from another, he represents force, strength, the ability to act decisively in a world where order can be fragile. And in the absence of Osiris, Set claims the throne, not as a caretaker, but as a ruler. This is where mythology shifts from cosmic explanation into political narrative, because the question is no longer simply how the universe functions. It becomes, who has the right to govern it? The answer comes through Horus. Horus is the son of Osiris and Isis. Born after Osiris's death, through Isis's determination and use of divine power, Horus represents continuity. He is the restoration of a broken line, the living embodiment of rightful kingship. But he is not born into stability. He is born into conflict, because Set does not willingly surrender power. And so begins one of the longest and most complex struggles in Egyptian mythology. A contest not just of strength, but of legitimacy. Horus is young when the conflict begins, and Isis, understanding the danger posed by Set, hides him, raises him in secrecy, protects him from a world that is not yet safe for him to enter. This period is crucial, because Horus is not immediately a king. He must grow, learn, become, and this mirrors a broader theme in Egyptian mythology. Order is not instantly restored. It must be rebuilt, carefully, gradually, with effort. When Horus finally emerges, he does not simply claim the throne. He must prove his right to it. And this leads to a series of confrontations between Horus and Set, some physical, some symbolic, some decided through judgment by other gods. These encounters are not simple battles. They are tests, each one exploring different aspects of what it means to rule. Strength, wisdom, endurance, control. In some versions of the myth, Horus and Set transform into animals and fight in the waters of the Nile. In others, they compete in contests designed to demonstrate superiority. And in still others, their conflict is brought before a divine tribunal, a council of gods who must decide who is the rightful king. This is where the mythology becomes particularly significant, because the decision is not based purely on power. It is based on ma'at, on order, on rightful inheritance. Horus, as the son of Osiris, represents continuity, legitimacy, the restoration of balance. Set, despite his strength, represents disruption, a break in the natural order. And while Set is not entirely rejected. He remains a necessary force within the cosmic system. He is not suited to rule. Because rule, in Egyptian thought, is not about dominance. It is about maintaining balance. After a prolonged struggle, the gods ultimately decide in favor of Horus. He becomes king, and in doing so, restores the line of Osiris. But the resolution is not absolute. Set is not destroyed. He is not erased from the system. Instead, he is integrated, given a role that reflects his nature without allowing him to destabilize the entire structure. In some traditions, Set becomes associated with protecting Ra during his nightly journey through the underworld, fighting against Apep, the embodiment of chaos. This is an important nuance, because it shows that Egyptian mythology does not view chaos as something that can be eliminated entirely. It must be contained, directed, balanced. Even destructive forces have a place within the system if they are properly controlled. The story of Horus and Set becomes the foundation for Egyptian kingship. Every pharaoh is seen as a living Horus, the rightful ruler, the one who maintains Maat on earth. And when the pharaoh dies, he becomes Osiris, joining the realm of the dead. This cycle reinforces the connection between mythology and governance. The king is not just a political leader. He is part of a divine narrative that ensures the continuity of order across generations. But this system also carries responsibility. Because if the king fails, if Maat is not upheld, then the consequences are not limited to the human world. They extend into the cosmos. Disorder in society reflects disorder in the universe, and vice versa. This belief shapes the entire structure of Egyptian civilization. Laws are not just rules. They are expressions of cosmic balance. Justice is not just fairness. It is alignment with Maat. And leadership is not just authority. It is a sacred duty. At the same time, the story of Horus and Set introduces a deeper understanding of conflict. It is not always destructive. It can be necessary, a process through which balance is restored, through which legitimacy is tested, through which the system corrects itself. This idea allows Egyptian mythology to accommodate complexity, to acknowledge that the world is not perfectly ordered, that challenges exist, that disruption occurs, but that through proper resolution, balance can be re-established. As Egyptian history progresses, this narrative continues to influence how rulers present themselves. Pharaohs depict themselves as Horus, defeating enemies, restoring order, and maintaining the stability of the kingdom. Temples and monuments reinforce this imagery, not just as propaganda, but as a reflection of deeply held belief. Because in Egyptian thought, myth and reality are not separate. They are intertwined. The stories of the gods are not distant tales. They are frameworks for understanding the present, guides for action, models for behavior. And as these stories continue to evolve, they begin to expand beyond kingship and cosmic order into something even more personal. The individual journey, the experience of death, the trials of the afterlife, and the question that now becomes central to every person, not just kings. What must be done to endure forever? Because the path that Osiris opened and that Horus secured is not automatic. It must be navigated. And the next phase of Egyptian mythology will define that journey in detail. By the time Egyptian mythology reaches full maturity, one idea has become undeniable. Death is not the end. But survival after death is not guaranteed. It must be prepared for, understood, and navigated. Because the afterlife is not a passive continuation of existence. It is a journey, structured, tested, and filled with challenges that determine whether the soul endures or disappears. This is where Egyptian mythology becomes intensely detailed, not just in broad concepts, but in specific instructions. Guidelines for the dead, a system designed to ensure that those who understand it can move successfully from life into eternity. At the center of this system is the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. But unlike many later interpretations of an underworld as a place of punishment, the Duat is not inherently negative. It is complex, a realm of transformation, a place where the soul must pass through stages, confront obstacles, and ultimately prove its alignment with Maat. The journey begins at the moment of death. But even before that moment, preparation is already underway. Because in Egyptian belief, the human being is not a single, unified entity. It is composed of multiple parts. The body, the ka, the life force, the ba, the personality, capable of movement between worlds, the name, the shadow. Each of these elements must be preserved and sustained for the individual to continue existing after death. This is why burial practices become so elaborate. The body must be protected, preserved through mummification, because without it, the ka cannot recognize its physical anchor. The ba cannot return. Identity itself begins to dissolve. Tombs are not simply places of rest. They are functional spaces, filled with objects, inscriptions, and provisions designed to support the soul in its journey. Food, clothing, tools, all represented physically or symbolically, ensuring that the deceased has what they need in the afterlife. Walls are covered with texts and images, scenes of daily life, rituals, guides, because knowledge is as important as preservation. To navigate the Duat, one must understand it. And so texts begin to emerge. What modern scholars call the Book of the Dead is not a single unified book, but a collection of spells, instructions, and declarations compiled over centuries. These texts serve a purpose: to guide the soul, to protect it from dangers, to ensure it knows what to say, what to do, and how to move through each stage of the afterlife. Because the Duat is not empty. It is filled with beings, guardians, creatures, forces that test the soul. Some require knowledge. Others require moral purity. Still others require the correct words, spoken with precision at the right moment. This introduces a crucial idea. Survival after death depends on both knowledge and character. It is not enough to have lived. One must have lived correctly, aligned with Maat, honest, balanced, respectful of order. Because at the center of the journey lies the most important moment of all: the judgment, the weighing of the heart. The soul is brought before a divine tribunal, a hall presided over by Osiris, surrounded by other deities who observe, evaluate, and enforce the outcome. At the center stands a scale. On one side, the heart of the deceased. On the other, the feather of Maat. This moment is absolute. There is no deception, no manipulation. The heart reflects truth. Everything the individual has done, every action, every intention, and it is weighed against the principle of order itself. If the heart is light, balanced, aligned with Maat, Then the individual passes. They are granted access to the afterlife, to a realm often described as the Field of Reeds, a perfected version of Egypt, where life continues in harmony, free from suffering, but still connected to the familiar rhythms of existence. But if the heart is heavy, burdened by wrongdoing, then the consequence is final. The heart is devoured by a creature known as Amit, a composite being part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile. This is not punishment in the traditional sense. It is erasure. The individual ceases to exist. No afterlife. No continuation. Just absence. This concept is one of the most striking aspects of Egyptian mythology, because it does not focus on eternal suffering. It focuses on eternal existence or its complete loss. And this makes the stakes absolute. At the same time, the judgment is not arbitrary. It is structured. The deceased is required to make declarations, often called the negative confession. Statements of what they have not done. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused harm. These are not simply claims. They are affirmations of alignment with Maat. And they reflect a broader moral framework that shapes Egyptian society. Because what happens after death is directly connected to how one lives. Ethics are not separate from belief. They are central to it. But even after judgment, the journey is not entirely over. The soul must integrate into the afterlife, must maintain its existence, must continue to function as a complete being. This is why the preservation of the name is so important. To speak a name is to sustain existence. To forget a name is to allow it to fade. And this idea extends beyond individuals, to kings, to gods, to the entire structure of Egyptian belief. Memory becomes a form of immortality. As long as something is remembered, it continues. And so monuments are built. Names are carved into stone. Stories are preserved. Because to be forgotten is to disappear. In this way, Egyptian mythology creates a complete system of existence that extends beyond life. A structure that connects the physical world to the spiritual one. That defines not just what happens after death, but how to prepare for it. And this system evolves over time. What begins as a privilege of kings gradually expands to include others. Access to the afterlife becomes more widely available. Texts that were once reserved for royal tombs appear in private burials. The promise of eternity becomes more inclusive, reflecting changes in society, in power, in belief. But the core principles remain the same. Maat governs everything. The soul must be preserved. The journey must be navigated. And the outcome depends on alignment with order. As Egyptian civilization continues to develop, these beliefs become deeply embedded in its structure, influencing art, architecture, politics, daily life. Because when eternity is real, everything in the present becomes preparation for it. And with this foundation in place, Egyptian mythology continues to expand, introducing new gods, new stories, and new interpretations of the forces that shape existence. Because while the journey of the soul defines what happens after death, the world of the gods continues to evolve, adapting to changes in power, culture, and understanding. And in that evolution, mythology itself becomes something dynamic, not fixed, but constantly reshaped by the civilization that believes in it. By this stage in Egyptian mythology, the structure of the universe is clear. Creation has emerged from chaos. The gods govern its balance. The afterlife offers continuity beyond death. And Ma'at binds everything together. But belief alone is not enough. Because in Egyptian thought, the gods do not simply exist at a distance. They must be sustained, maintained, interacted with. And this is where mythology moves from narrative into daily practice, into ritual, into architecture, into the physical world. Because for the Egyptians, the gods are present, not everywhere in a vague sense, but specifically, locally, tangibly. And the places where that presence is strongest are the temples. A temple is not just a place of worship. It is the house of a god, a controlled environment where the boundary between the human and divine worlds becomes thin. Every temple is designed with intention, aligned with cosmic principles, structured to reflect the order of the universe. From the outer walls to the innermost sanctuary, the space becomes progressively more restricted, more sacred, more connected to the divine. At the heart of the temple lies the sanctuary, a dark, enclosed chamber where the statue of the god resides. But this statue is not symbolic. It is not a representation. It is believed to be the physical vessel through which the god is present, alive, aware, and responsive to ritual. This belief shapes everything that happens within the temple. Because if the god is truly present, then the temple must function like a living system. The god must be cared for, fed, clothed, protected, and this responsibility falls to the priests. Priests in ancient Egypt are not simply religious figures. They are caretakers of the divine. Their role is not to preach to the public, but to maintain the daily relationship between the gods and the world. Each day begins with ritual. The sanctuary is opened. The statue of the god is revealed, washed, dressed, offered food and drink, perfumed, honored. These actions are not symbolic gestures. They are necessary, because through them, the god remains active within the world. Without ritual, the connection weakens. And if the connection weakens, Ma'at is threatened. This transforms religion into a system of maintenance, a continuous effort to sustain balance, not just through belief, but through action. Precise, repetitive, uninterrupted. At the same time, temples are not isolated structures. They are deeply connected to the political system. Because the pharaoh is the ultimate intermediary between gods and humans. In theory, every ritual performed in the temple is done on behalf of the king, even if he is not physically present. The priests act as his extension, maintaining the divine order that legitimizes his rule. This reinforces the idea that governance and mythology are inseparable. The stability of the state depends on the stability of the cosmos, and the stability of the cosmos depends on the proper performance of ritual. But temples are also centers of knowledge. They preserve texts, record events, develop theological ideas. Over time, different temples become associated with different gods and different interpretations of mythology. In Thebes, Ammon rises to prominence, a god associated with hidden power, later merged with Ra to form Amun-Ra. In Memphis, Ptah remains central as a creator god associated with thought and craftsmanship. In Heliopolis, the solar theology of Ra dominates. These regional differences do not create contradiction. They create layers. Egyptian mythology is not a single unified system. It is a network of interconnected traditions, each emphasizing different aspects of the same underlying reality. This flexibility allows the religion to adapt. As political power shifts from one region to another, the prominence of certain gods increases or decreases, but the overall structure remains intact. Mayat persists. The afterlife persists. The role of the king persists. And the gods continue to interact with the world through ritual. At the same time, temples play an economic role. They control land, resources, labor. They are institutions as much as they are sacred spaces. This gives them influence, power, and in some periods, tension arises between the authority of the king and the authority of powerful priesthoods. Because while the pharaoh is theoretically the highest religious figure, the priests are the ones who perform the rituals daily, who maintain the temples, who control access to the gods. This dynamic adds another layer to Egyptian mythology. It is not only about gods and cosmic order. It is also about how that order is managed within society. Who interprets it? Who enforces it? Who benefits from it? But for the ordinary person, direct access to temple rituals is limited. Most ceremonies take place within restricted areas. Only priests and select officials are allowed to enter the inner spaces. This does not mean that religion is distant from everyday life. It means that it operates on multiple levels. Public festivals bring the gods out of the temple. Statues are carried in processions. People gather, offer prayers, seek blessings. These moments allow the wider population to interact with the divine more directly. But even outside of these events, the influence of mythology is constant. Amulets are worn for protection. Household shrines are maintained. Personal prayers are offered. Because while the temple is the center of formal ritual, the gods are still present in daily life. In health, in fertility, in success, in failure, every aspect of existence is connected to the divine. And maintaining balance is a shared responsibility. As Egyptian history progresses, this system becomes increasingly complex. New gods rise in prominence. Others merge or fade. Theological ideas evolve. But the core structure remains remarkably stable, because it is built on principles that are deeply tied to the environment. The predictability of the Nile, the visibility of the sun, the contrast between fertile land and desert. These natural elements reinforce the idea of order emerging from chaos, of balance requiring constant maintenance, and of life existing within a larger, structured system. But even systems that appear stable can be challenged. And in the next phase of Egyptian mythology, that challenge will come from within. From a ruler who attempts something unprecedented. Not a reinterpretation of the gods, but a complete transformation. A shift away from the traditional structure that has defined Egyptian belief for centuries. A moment when mythology itself becomes contested, and when the balance between order and disruption is tested in a way unlike anything before. For centuries, Egyptian mythology evolves through accumulation. New gods emerge. Old gods merge. Regional traditions intertwine. But the structure itself remains stable, flexible, layered, resilient. It does not break under change, it absorbs it. Until, for the first time, someone attempts not to adapt the system, but to replace it. This moment comes during the reign of a pharaoh known today as Akhenaten. And what he attempts is unprecedented in Egyptian history. Not a reform, not a reinterpretation, but a complete redefinition of the relationship between gods, kingship, and the universe itself. Before Akhenaten, Egyptian religion is plural, complex, interconnected. Gods represent different aspects of existence: sun, sky, earth, chaos, order, life, death. They overlap, merge, coexist, and this multiplicity is not seen as contradiction. It is seen as completeness. But Akhenaten rejects this. He elevates a single deity above all others. The Aten, the visible disk of the sun, not the hidden force behind it, not a layered divine personality like Ra or Amun-Ra, but the physical manifestation of sunlight itself. Direct, immediate, universal. Under Akhenaten's vision, the Aten is not just another god. It is the only god. Everything else, every temple, every priesthood, every traditional deity, is pushed aside. This is not just a religious shift. It is a structural upheaval. Because Egyptian mythology is not isolated from society. It is embedded in it. Temples control resources. Priests hold power. Cities are tied to specific gods. To remove the traditional system is to disrupt the entire balance of the state. But Akhenaten proceeds. He changes his own name from Amenhotep, which honors the god Amun, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He founds a new capital city, Akhetaten, built specifically to center this new belief system. He redirects worship away from traditional temples, closes or diminishes their influence, and places himself and his family as the primary intermediaries between the Aten and humanity. This last point is critical, because while the Aten is presented as a universal force, access to it is controlled. The pharaoh becomes the sole channel through which divine energy flows. Unlike earlier systems, where priests and rituals maintain connection to multiple gods, this new structure centralizes divine authority entirely in the king. It simplifies theology, but concentrates power. At the same time, the nature of the divine itself changes. Traditional Egyptian gods are complex. They have personalities, stories, conflicts, relationships. They interact with the world in dynamic ways. The Aten, by contrast, is abstract. It does not engage in narrative. It does not participate in mythic drama. It simply exists, radiating life, providing energy, sustaining existence through its light. This creates a different kind of religious experience. Less about storytelling, more about presence. Less about navigating a complex divine system, more about acknowledging a single, all-encompassing force. In artistic representations, this shift becomes visible. Traditional depictions of gods, with animal heads, symbolic forms, and intricate iconography, are replaced by images of the sun disk with rays extending downward, ending in small hands that offer life to the royal family. Even art itself changes, becomes more fluid, more naturalistic, less rigid than earlier styles, reflecting a broader transformation in how reality is being interpreted. But despite its ambition, the Aten Revolution faces a fundamental problem. It disrupts too much, too quickly. Egyptian mythology is not just a belief system. It is a network of practices, institutions, and cultural habits built over centuries. People are accustomed to interacting with multiple gods, to local traditions, to rituals that connect them personally to the divine. The Aten system removes that complexity. But in doing so, it also removes familiarity. And more importantly, it removes access. Because if only the pharaoh can truly interact with the Aten, then the average person is left at a distance. This creates tension, not always openly expressed, but present. At the same time, the political implications are significant. The powerful priesthood of Ammon, based in Thebes, loses influence. Resources are redirected. Authority is centralized. And while this may strengthen the pharaoh in the short term, it destabilizes the broader system that supports him. For a time, the new order holds. Akhenaten rules. The Aten is worshipped. The traditional gods are suppressed. But beneath the surface, the old system does not disappear. It waits. Because mythology, especially one as deeply embedded as Egypt's, does not vanish easily. It persists in memory, in practice, in hidden continuity. And when Akhenaten dies, the structure he built begins to collapse almost immediately. His successors reverse his reforms. The capital is abandoned. The temples of the old gods are restored. The name of Akhenaten is removed from records, erased, as if the disruption itself must be undone. This reaction is not just political. It is symbolic, a restoration of Maat. Because the Aten revolution, despite its intentions, is seen as a break in balance, an attempt to impose order in a way that disrupts the natural complexity of existence. And in Egyptian thought, balance is not achieved through simplification. It is achieved through harmony between multiple forces, multiple perspectives, multiple truths. The return to traditional mythology is not a step backward. It is a restabilization, a recognition that the system's strength lies in its adaptability, not its reduction. But the Aten period leaves a lasting mark. It demonstrates that even deeply rooted belief systems can be challenged, that kingship has limits, and that the relationship between humans and the divine is not fixed. It can be reshaped, reinterpreted, even if only temporarily. As Egypt moves forward, mythology continues to evolve, but now with a new awareness. That disruption is possible, that order can be broken, and that restoration, while achievable, is never guaranteed. Because beneath the surface of stability, the tension between change and continuity remains. And it is this tension that will shape the next phase of Egyptian mythology. As new influences emerge, as foreign powers enter the land, and as the ancient system begins to interact with ideas far beyond the Nile. After the collapse of the Aten Revolution, Egyptian mythology does not return unchanged. It stabilizes, reasserts its core structure. But something fundamental has shifted. There is now an awareness, subtle but undeniable, that the system can be disrupted and restored. And as Egypt moves into later periods of its history, that awareness becomes increasingly relevant. Because the next transformation does not come from within. It comes from outside. For centuries, Egypt had existed as a relatively self-contained civilization, shaped primarily by the rhythms of the Nile and its own internal developments. But now, new forces begin to enter the landscape, foreign rulers, external cultures, and expanding empires that bring with them different ways of understanding the world. And Egyptian mythology, for all its stability, must adapt. The first major wave of this transformation begins during periods of foreign rule, when Egypt comes under the control of outside powers, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, and eventually Persians. These rulers do not always attempt to erase Egyptian religion. In many cases, they adopt it, align themselves with it, because they understand something essential. To rule Egypt, one must align with Maat. And to align with Maat, one must engage with the gods. This creates a unique dynamic. Foreign rulers present themselves as pharaohs. They participate in rituals. They build temples. They honor Egyptian deities, not necessarily out of belief, but out of necessity. Because legitimacy in Egypt is not purely political. It is cosmic, and without it, authority is unstable. At the same time, Egyptian mythology begins to absorb external influences, not through replacement, but through integration. New gods appear, some brought by foreign populations, others emerging from the blending of traditions. This process does not weaken the system. It expands it, because Egyptian mythology is inherently flexible. It does not demand exclusivity. It allows for coexistence, for reinterpretation, for layering of meanings. One of the most significant transformations occurs during the arrival of the Greeks, following the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. With the establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt enters a new phase, one where Greek and Egyptian cultures interact deeply and continuously. And within this interaction, mythology begins to fuse. Greek rulers adopt Egyptian titles, present themselves as pharaohs, participate in traditional rituals, but they also bring their own gods, their own philosophical frameworks, their own interpretations of the divine. The result is not conflict, but synthesis, a blending of systems that produces entirely new forms of belief. Perhaps the most striking example of this is the creation of Serapis, a deliberately constructed deity designed to unify Greek and Egyptian religious concepts into a single figure. Serapis combines aspects of Osiris and Apis, the sacred bull, with characteristics familiar to Greek audiences, such as those associated with Zeus and Hades. This is not an organic development. It is intentional, a political and cultural solution to a complex problem. How do you govern a population with deeply rooted traditions while introducing a new ruling class with its own beliefs? The answer is fusion. Create a god that belongs to both, and through that god, create a shared framework of understanding. This moment marks a significant shift in Egyptian mythology. For the first time, gods are not only evolving naturally through regional variation. They are being constructed to serve a purpose, to bridge cultures, to maintain stability, to preserve continuity in a changing world. At the same time, traditional gods remain active. Isis, in particular, begins to expand far beyond Egypt. Her identity evolves. She becomes a universal figure associated with motherhood, protection, magic, and healing. Her worship spreads across the Mediterranean, into Greece, into Rome, transforming from a local deity into an international one. This expansion reflects a broader change. Egyptian mythology is no longer confined to the Nile. It is moving outward, interacting with new audiences, adapting to new contexts, and in doing so, it begins to take on new meanings. But this process is not without tension, because while fusion can create unity, it can also dilute specificity. Traditional practices begin to change. Interpretations shift. The relationship between humans and gods evolves. And over time, the original structure of Egyptian mythology becomes less dominant. Not erased, but transformed. As Egypt eventually comes under Roman rule, this transformation continues. Egyptian gods are integrated into the broader religious landscape of the Roman Empire. Some are reinterpreted through Roman perspectives. Others maintain their distinct identities but operate within a much larger system. The temples continue to function. Rituals continue to be performed. But the context has changed. Egypt is no longer an independent center of power. It is part of something larger. And this shift has consequences for mythology. Because belief systems are always connected to the structures that support them. When those structures change, belief must adapt. And yet, despite all these transformations, the core principles remain remarkably resilient. Mayat still matters. The afterlife still exists. The journey of the soul still follows familiar patterns. Even as names change, even as gods merge or evolve, the underlying framework persists. This is the strength of Egyptian mythology. It is not rigid. It does not depend on a single form. It survives through adaptation, through its ability to absorb change without losing its identity. But there is a limit to adaptation, a point at which external forces do not simply influence the system, but replace it. And that moment is approaching. Because beyond cultural fusion, beyond political integration, a new form of belief is beginning to spread across the region. One that operates very differently from the layered, flexible structure of Egyptian mythology. A system that emphasizes singular truth, exclusive worship, and a fundamentally different understanding of the divine. As this new belief system grows, it begins to reshape the religious landscape of Egypt. Gradually at first, then more decisively. And in that transformation, the ancient mythology that has endured for thousands of years will face its greatest challenge yet. Not from invasion, not from political collapse, but from a shift in how people understand existence itself. For thousands of years, Egyptian mythology survives through change. It absorbs new rulers, adapts to foreign ideas, expands beyond its original boundaries. But now it faces something fundamentally different. Not adaptation, but replacement. Because as Egypt moves into the late Roman period, a new belief system begins to spread, one that does not integrate with existing traditions. It excludes them. That system is Christianity. At first, its presence in Egypt is limited. Small communities form. Ideas circulate quietly. The traditional temples still stand. The rituals continue. The gods are still honored. From the perspective of the broader population, the ancient system remains intact. But beneath the surface, a shift is beginning. Christianity operates on principles very different from Egyptian mythology. It emphasizes one God, one truth, one path. It does not accommodate multiple interpretations of the divine. It does not merge with existing gods. It replaces them. This creates a tension that grows over time. Because Egyptian religion is built on coexistence, on layering, on the idea that multiple truths can exist simultaneously. Christianity rejects that framework. And as its influence increases, that rejection becomes more visible, more direct, more difficult to ignore. At first, the transformation is gradual. Some individuals convert. Communities begin to shift. But the traditional structures remain. Temples continue to function. Priests continue their rituals. The connection between humans and the gods persists. For a time, both systems exist side by side. But coexistence is temporary, because Christianity is not simply another layer within the system. It is a restructuring of the system itself. And as it gains political support, that restructuring accelerates. The turning point comes when the Roman Empire begins to adopt Christianity as its dominant religion. What was once a minority belief becomes institutional, supported by authority, enforced through policy. And with that shift, the position of Egyptian mythology changes dramatically. It is no longer one tradition among many. It becomes something else, a relic, an outdated system, a form of belief that must be replaced. Temples begin to lose support. Resources are redirected. Priesthoods weaken. Rituals become less frequent. And over time, some temples are closed entirely. This process is not always immediate or uniform. In some regions, traditional practices continue longer than in others. In more remote areas, older beliefs persist. But the overall trend is clear. The system that sustained Egyptian mythology for millennia is dissolving. Not through destruction alone, but through disuse. Because mythology depends on practice, on repetition, on ritual. And when those practices stop, the connection weakens. Eventually, it disappears. The closure of temples marks a profound shift. Because temples were not just places of worship. They were the centers of divine interaction. Without them, the daily maintenance of Maat, through ritual, offering, and presence, ceases. From the perspective of traditional Egyptian belief, this is not a small change. It is a cosmic one. Because if the rituals that sustain the gods stop, what happens to the gods? This question does not have a single answer. From a modern perspective, the gods do not vanish in a literal sense. They remain as part of cultural memory, as stories, as symbols. But within the framework of Egyptian mythology itself, the answer is more complex. The gods were sustained through interaction, through acknowledgement, through the ongoing relationship between the divine and the human world. Without that relationship, their presence changes. It becomes less immediate, less active, more distant, and eventually silent. At the same time, Christianity introduces a different understanding of the afterlife, a different moral framework, a different relationship between humans and the divine. The structured journey through the duat, the weighing of the heart, the preservation of the body. These ideas begin to fade, replaced by new interpretations of death, judgment, and eternity. For many, this transition is not purely forced. It is also internal, a gradual shift in belief, a reorientation of identity. Because as generations pass, the memory of the old system becomes less immediate, less lived, more historical. But the process is not without resistance. There are moments of tension, of conflict, of attempts to preserve older traditions. Some temples remain active longer than others. Some communities continue to practice elements of traditional belief in modified forms. But the direction of change is irreversible. By the time the last temples close, the transformation is complete. Egyptian mythology, as a living system of belief and practice, has ended. Not erased, but no longer active in the way it once was. And yet, something remarkable happens. Because while the rituals stop, the stories remain. The structures, the symbols, The names of the gods. They do not disappear. They transition from religion to history, from lived experience to recorded memory, from active practice to cultural legacy. And in that transition, Egyptian mythology enters a new phase, one that will carry it far beyond the boundaries of ancient Egypt. Because even as the temples fall silent, the ideas do not die. They wait to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and reimagined by civilizations that come long after. When the temples of Egypt fall silent, it does not mean the end of Egyptian mythology's influence. It means the beginning of a new phase of existence, one not defined by ritual or priesthood, but by observation, interpretation, and memory filtered through outsiders. Because even as traditional Egyptian religious practice fades, Egypt itself does not disappear from the world stage. It becomes something else, a subject of fascination, a land of ancient mystery, a civilization whose past is already distant enough to feel legendary. For the Greek-speaking world, especially during and after the Hellenistic period, Egypt is not simply a neighboring culture. It is an ancient one. Even when it is still functioning as a living society, it carries the weight of deep time. And this perception shapes how its mythology is recorded. Greek writers, philosophers, and historians begin to document Egyptian beliefs. But they do so through their own frameworks, their own categories, their own assumptions about how religion and mythology should function. One of the most influential figures in this process is Herodotus, who travels through Egypt and attempts to describe its customs, gods, and history. But what he records is not a direct transmission of Egyptian religious thought. It is an interpretation, a translation of one cultural system into another. Egyptian gods are often equated with Greek ones. Ra becomes associated with Helios, Isis with Demeter or Aphrodite, Osiris with Dionysus or Hades. Set is sometimes linked to chaotic or foreign figures within Greek mythological frameworks. This process of identification, known later as Interpretatio Graeca, creates both clarity and distortion. It allows Greek audiences to understand Egyptian gods through familiar categories. But it also flattens their complexity, because Egyptian deities are not direct equivalents of Greek ones. They operate within a fundamentally different system, one based on multiplicity, overlap, and layered meaning. But in translation, nuance is often lost. At the same time, Egyptian mythology begins to influence philosophical thought in the wider Mediterranean world. Thinkers in Greece and later Rome become fascinated by Egypt's apparent antiquity, its emphasis on cosmic order, its structured approach to the afterlife, its connection between morality and existence beyond death. Egypt becomes a symbol of ancient wisdom, a source of hidden knowledge, not always accurately understood, but deeply respected. As time progresses, Roman influence expands across the region. Egypt becomes part of the Roman Empire. And with this integration, Egyptian religion continues to be observed, but increasingly through Roman cultural lenses. Some Egyptian deities are incorporated into Roman religious practice. Isis, in particular, becomes widely worshipped across the Roman world. Her image spreads far beyond the Nile. She becomes a universal mother figure, a goddess of protection, healing, and magic. Her cult adapts to new environments while maintaining core aspects of her identity. This is one of the last major phases in which Egyptian mythology remains actively practiced beyond Egypt itself. But even this transformation is not permanent. As earlier described, the rise of Christianity eventually changes the religious landscape of the Roman Empire. And with it, the visibility of traditional Egyptian gods declines. Yet even after this decline, Egyptian mythology does not disappear from human thought. Instead, it enters a different domain, the realm of scholarship, curiosity, and reconstruction. During the medieval period in Europe, knowledge of Egypt becomes fragmented, often filtered through religious, linguistic, and cultural barriers. Egypt is no longer a living religious system in the eyes of most outside observers. It becomes a symbol of antiquity, of lost knowledge, of ancient power that is no longer accessible in its original form. And because the original meanings of many texts and symbols are no longer understood, interpretation becomes increasingly speculative. Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example, are seen as mysterious symbols rather than a functional writing system. Temples are viewed as enigmatic structures. Myths are retold without full context. This period transforms Egyptian mythology again, not as religion, not as living tradition, but as mystery. And it is this mystery that fuels later rediscovery. Because when European scholars of the Renaissance and Enlightenment begin to revisit ancient civilizations, Egypt stands out as something particularly intriguing. Ancient, complex, partially lost, but still partially visible. However, true understanding remains limited until a breakthrough occurs. The decipherment of hieroglyphs in the 19th century, led by scholars such as Jean-François Champollion, opens a new era of Egyptology. For the first time in centuries, Egyptian texts can be read again in their original form. Myths, religious texts, funerary inscriptions, and historical records become accessible not as symbols, but as language. This changes everything. Egyptian mythology is no longer just interpretation layered upon interpretation. It becomes reconstructible. Scholars begin to piece together original narratives, to compare regional variations, to understand the complexity that earlier translations had flattened. And what emerges is a system far more intricate than the simplified versions that had circulated for centuries. A mythology built not on single truths, but on interwoven perspectives, multiple creation stories, multiple divine roles, multiple interpretations of the same cosmic principles. At the same time, modern archaeology uncovers temples, tombs, and artifacts that reveal how deeply mythology was embedded in daily life. It was not separate from society. It was its foundation. And through this rediscovery, Egyptian mythology begins a new transformation. Not as religion, not as forgotten system, but as global cultural heritage, a subject of academic study, artistic inspiration, literary reinterpretation, and popular imagination. Because even though the original belief system is no longer practiced in its traditional form, its influence continues, shaping how people think about death, about gods, about ancient civilizations, and about the relationship between myth and reality itself. But this rediscovery also introduces a final paradox. The more Egyptian mythology is studied, the more it expands beyond its original context, becoming not just a historical system, but a symbol that continues to evolve with each generation that encounters it. And in that ongoing evolution, the ancient world is never truly closed. It is continuously reinterpreted, reconstructed, and reimagined. By the time Egyptian mythology enters the modern world, it is no longer a living religion. It is something stranger, something larger, a system of stories that has survived the collapse of its original context and now exists across multiple layers of interpretation at once: academic, artistic, political, and popular. And unlike many ancient mythologies that fade into obscurity, Egyptian mythology does something unusual. It becomes globally recognizable, not because it is fully understood, but because it is endlessly reinterpreted. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Egypt becomes one of the central focuses of archaeology and historical scholarship. Excavations uncover vast temple complexes, tombs sealed for thousands of years, and inscriptions that preserve entire theological systems in stone. Every discovery adds another fragment to the reconstructed picture. But even as knowledge increases, interpretation diversifies. Egypt is no longer just a historical civilization. It becomes a canvas onto which different eras project their own ideas. In literature, Egypt is often portrayed as mysterious and otherworldly, a place of hidden knowledge, ancient curses, lost wisdom buried beneath sand. This is not Egypt as it was. It is Egypt as it is imagined. And that distinction becomes increasingly important. Because mythology, when removed from its original cultural framework, begins to function differently. It becomes symbolic, flexible, adaptable. Egyptian gods, once part of a structured system of cosmic maintenance, are now reinterpreted as archetypes. Ra becomes the eternal sun. Osiris becomes death and rebirth. Isis becomes motherhood and magic. Set becomes chaos and disruption. Horus becomes rightful power. These interpretations are simplified, but powerful. They allow Egyptian mythology to survive in a world that no longer shares its original assumptions. At the same time, Egypt becomes deeply embedded in global popular culture. Museums display its artifacts. Films recreate its imagery. Novels and comics reimagine its gods. Video games turn its myths into interactive worlds. And in each case, Egyptian mythology is reshaped again. Not as a fixed system, but as a flexible language of symbolism, a vocabulary of ancient power that can be adapted to new narratives. This is where Egyptian mythology achieves something rare. It becomes independent of its original religious function. It survives as cultural structure. Even when belief has shifted, the symbols remain compelling. But this transformation also creates tension. Because the deeper and more complex original system is often reduced in popular retellings. The nuance of regional variations, the philosophical depth of Ma'at, the interconnected nature of gods and political order. These elements are frequently simplified or lost. Yet beneath these reinterpretations, the original mythology still exists in its recovered texts and archaeological records. And modern scholarship continues to refine understanding of it. Each new translation, each new excavation, each new discovery adds detail to a system that was never truly static in the first place. Because Egyptian mythology was always evolving. Even in antiquity, it contained contradictions, overlaps, and regional differences. What modern research reveals is not a single unified religion, but a dynamic network of beliefs that changed over time while maintaining core principles. Among those principles, Ma'at remains central. The idea that existence depends on balance, that order is not automatic, that chaos is always present at the edges of reality. This idea resonates far beyond ancient Egypt. It appears in philosophical discussions, in modern storytelling, in psychological interpretations of myth, and in cultural studies that examine how civilizations understand order and disorder. Egyptian mythology, in this sense, becomes more than history. It becomes a framework for thinking about how systems sustain themselves, how societies maintain stability, how meaning is constructed over time. At the same time, Egypt itself continues to evolve as a modern nation. Its ancient heritage remains visible in monuments, language traces, and cultural identity. But it exists alongside entirely new political, social, and technological realities. The ancient and modern worlds coexist in the same geographical space, but belong to entirely different systems of thought. And this duality reinforces Egypt's unique position in global imagination. It is both contemporary and ancient, living and historical, real and mythologized. Few places carry such layered identity. But even as scholarship advances and interpretations deepen, Egyptian mythology continues to do what it has always done. It adapts, because myths do not survive by remaining unchanged. They survive by being reinterpreted. And in the modern world, Egyptian mythology has become one of the most reinterpreted systems of belief in human history. Not because it is fully preserved in its original form, but because it is endlessly capable of transformation. And that transformation leads into its final phase, not as religion, not as history alone, but as something even broader. A permanent part of global cultural memory. Something that no longer belongs to Egypt alone, but to the entire world. At this stage, Egyptian mythology no longer belongs to a single place, a single language, or even a single historical context. It has become something distributed, a system of symbols that travels across time, reshaped by each culture that encounters it. And unlike many ancient belief systems that remain confined to academic study, Egyptian mythology continues to live in a more active way, embedded in psychology, storytelling, design, philosophy, and popular culture. It has become less a religion and more a framework for understanding human experience. One of the most important reasons for this transformation is the internal structure of Egyptian mythology itself. Because unlike systems built around a single linear narrative, Egyptian mythology is layered. It does not insist on one creation story. It allows multiple. It does not enforce a single interpretation of the gods. It accommodates regional variation. It does not separate myth from reality. It integrates them. This flexibility makes it uniquely adaptable to modern reinterpretation. In psychology, for example, figures such as Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Set are often reinterpreted as archetypes. Osiris becomes the principle of death and renewal. Isis becomes protection, healing, and restorative intelligence. Horus becomes identity, legitimacy, and realized potential. Set becomes disruption, conflict, and necessary chaos. Ra becomes cyclical consciousness, the repeated structure of order sustaining itself against entropy. These interpretations are not historically literal, but they are culturally powerful. They allow Egyptian mythology to function as a symbolic system that explains patterns in human behavior, narrative structure, and emotional experience. At the same time, the concept of Maat becomes increasingly significant in modern philosophical discussions, not as a religious doctrine, but as an idea, a principle of balance between forces that are constantly in tension, order and chaos, stability and change, creation and dissolution. In this sense, Egyptian mythology becomes less about gods acting in a distant cosmos and more about forces that operate within systems of reality itself. It becomes abstract, universal, applicable beyond its original cultural setting. But this transformation also raises an important question. What is lost when mythology becomes symbolism? Because in its original context, Egyptian mythology was not abstract. It was lived, performed, maintained through ritual, language, and daily interaction with sacred space. Temples were not metaphors. They were operational centers of divine presence. The gods were not archetypes. They were active participants in the structure of existence. And Mahat was not an idea. It was a requirement for survival. Modern interpretation necessarily simplifies this complexity. It extracts meaning while removing function. But in doing so, it also allows the mythology to persist in a world that no longer shares its original assumptions. This is the paradox of survival through reinterpretation. The system endures, but in altered form. At the same time, Egypt's ancient mythology continues to influence artistic expression in profound ways. In literature, it appears in retellings that explore immortality, power, and divine conflict. In film, it becomes visual language. Pyramids, hieroglyphs, gods, and desert landscapes used to evoke mystery and antiquity. In games and interactive media, it becomes immersive mythology, allowing audiences to engage directly with reconstructed versions of ancient worlds. And in all these forms, Egyptian mythology continues to evolve, not as a fixed canon, but as a living set of ideas. Meanwhile, archaeology continues to expand understanding of the original system. Each excavation adds new depth. New texts reveal previously unknown variations of myths. New discoveries refine interpretations of ritual and belief. And slowly, the ancient world becomes clearer, not as a single unified system, but as a complex and dynamic civilization that constantly negotiated its own understanding of reality. This ongoing discovery reinforces an important truth. Egyptian mythology was never static. It was always in motion, always adapting, always responding to cultural, political, and environmental change. And that adaptability is precisely what allowed it to survive in memory long after its original religious structure ended. Today, Egyptian mythology exists in three overlapping forms at once: as historical system reconstructed by scholarship, as symbolic language used in psychology and storytelling, and as cultural memory embedded in global imagination. Each version is different. Each is incomplete. But together, they form a modern continuation of something ancient. Not in belief, but in meaning. Because even though the temples are silent and the rituals no longer performed in their original form, the underlying questions Egyptian mythology tried to answer remain the same. How does order emerge from chaos? What happens after death? What holds reality together when everything changes? These are not Egyptian questions alone. They are human questions. And that is why the mythology endures. Not because it survived unchanged, but because it continues to be relevant in new forms. And in that way, Egyptian mythology has achieved something rare in human history. It has become timeless not by resisting change, but by absorbing it. By the time Egyptian mythology is fully absorbed into the modern world, something unexpected happens. It stops being complete, not because it is gone, but because it is fragmented. What survives is enormous: temples, inscriptions, papyri, tomb paintings, catalogues of spells, hymns, and mythic narratives. But what is missing is just as important: Entire regional traditions, local cult practices, oral variations never written down, context that was obvious to ancient practitioners but invisible to modern readers. Egyptian mythology, as it is known today, is therefore not a single recovered system. It is a reconstruction built from surviving fragments. And that reconstruction is constantly being revised. Every new excavation changes something. Every new translation shifts interpretation. Every new discovery reveals that earlier certainty was incomplete. This is especially true in the study of funerary texts, like those associated with the afterlife journey through the duat. What earlier scholars once treated as a single coherent book is now understood as a collection of evolving compositions. Spells were added, removed, rewritten, and adapted over centuries. They were not fixed scripture. They were practical tools, dynamic instructions for navigating the unknown. And this realization transforms how Egyptian mythology is understood. It is no longer seen as a rigid theological system frozen in time. It is seen as a living tradition that changed continuously for over 3,000 years. But this also introduces a challenge. Reconstruction is never neutral. Modern scholars must interpret incomplete evidence. They must decide how fragments connect. They must choose between competing readings of damaged texts. And in doing so, they inevitably shape the mythology they are trying to recover. Different academic traditions emphasize different aspects. Some focus on religious structure, others on political function, others on literary symbolism. As a result, multiple versions of Egyptian mythology now exist simultaneously in modern scholarship. Not contradictory in intent, but diverse in emphasis. This mirrors, in an unexpected way, the original nature of Egyptian belief itself. Because even in antiquity, there was never just one unified version of the gods. There were many, coexisting, overlapping, sometimes conflicting. What modern reconstruction reveals is not a simplification of that system, but a reflection of its complexity. At the same time, the physical remains of Egyptian mythology continue to exert influence. Temples still stand, some restored, some partially buried, some reduced to ruins. Yet even in ruin, they carry meaning. The alignment of structures with celestial patterns, the precision of inscriptions, the scale of architectural ambition. All of it reflects a worldview in which human construction is directly tied to cosmic order. But without the rituals that once animated these spaces, they become something else. Artifacts of belief rather than active participants in it. And this transformation changes how they are perceived. What was once a functioning temple becomes a historical site. What was once a sacred object becomes a museum exhibit. What was once a living myth becomes reconstructed narrative. But even in this state, something persists. A sense of presence. A recognition that these systems were not arbitrary. They were carefully constructed responses to fundamental questions about existence. Why does the sun rise? Why does the Nile flood? Why does life end, and what follows it? Egyptian mythology does not answer these questions in a scientific sense. It answers them in a structural one, by embedding them into a coherent system of meaning. And that system remains compelling even when removed from its original religious context. This is why Egyptian mythology continues to appear in modern storytelling, not as a fixed doctrine, but as a source of narrative architecture. Its gods are not just characters. They are functions within a system of meaning. Its stories are not just myths. They are models of transformation, death and rebirth, conflict and resolution, order and disruption. These patterns are universal enough to be continually reinterpreted, but specific enough to retain distinct identity. And as modern understanding deepens, another realization emerges. Egyptian mythology was never just about gods. It was about relationships between humans and nature, between rulers and society, between life and death, between stability and change. The gods are expressions of these relationships, not replacements for them. This shifts interpretation again, from seeing mythology as a pantheon of beings, to seeing it as a map of forces, a symbolic system for organizing reality. And this perspective allows Egyptian mythology to continue evolving even now. Because as long as those fundamental relationships exist, the mythology remains relevant, even if it is no longer worshipped, even if its original rituals are no longer performed, even if its temples are silent. It persists as meaning, as structure, as memory reconstructed through time. And in that sense, Egyptian mythology has never truly stopped changing. It simply changed the form of its existence, from lived religion to fragmented record, to reconstructed system, to symbolic language. And now, as it continues to be studied, reinterpreted, and reimagined, it enters yet another phase. A mythology not of ancient Egypt alone, but of human understanding itself. In the modern world, Egyptian mythology undergoes yet another transformation, one that the ancient priests of Karnak or the scribes of the Book of the Dead could never have anticipated. It becomes digital, not in the sense of preservation alone, but in the sense of active reconstruction inside new technological environments. Here, Egyptian mythology is no longer confined to temples, papyri, or even books. It exists in databases, game engines, virtual reconstructions, cinematic universes, and algorithm-driven storytelling systems that continuously reinterpret ancient symbols for new audiences. And in this environment, something important happens. Egyptian mythology stops being a fixed past, even in scholarship. It becomes a dynamic system again, rebuilt every time it is used. In video games, the gods are reimagined as interactive entities. Ra becomes a mechanic of cyclical time and power. Osiris becomes a narrative of resurrection systems. Set becomes chaos-driven, antagonistic force design. Horus becomes legitimacy mechanics or hero archetypes. These are not accurate reconstructions in the historical sense, but they are structurally faithful in a deeper way. They preserve the relationships between order, disruption, death, rebirth, and authority. In other words, they preserve function even when form is changed. This is where Egyptian mythology shows something unusual compared to many other ancient systems. It is highly systemic, meaning its core ideas can be translated into rules, cycles, and interacting components without collapsing. Few mythologies survive this level of abstraction, but Egyptian mythology does, because at its core, it is already structured like a system. Creation emerges from chaos, none right arrow ordered world. Order must be maintained, Ma'at. Disorder is always present, Set Apep. Life is cyclical, Ra's daily journey. Death is transitional, Osiris and the Duat. Legitimacy is contested and restored, Horus versus Set. This makes it uniquely adaptable to modern computational thinking. And so it appears in simulations, world-building systems, and even educational models. But digital transformation also changes something else. Access. For the first time, large portions of Egyptian mythology are widely accessible across global audiences simultaneously. Museums digitize collections. Archaeological sites are mapped in 3D. Hieroglyphic corpora are searchable. Reconstructed temples are explorable in virtual space. What was once geographically and linguistically restricted becomes globally distributed. And this creates a new kind of mythology, a shared reconstructed imagination of ancient Egypt that exists across millions of individual interpretations. But with this expansion comes distortion, because digital culture tends towards simplification. Symbols become icons, gods become archetypes, complex theological systems become aesthetic frameworks. Egypt becomes a visual language. Pyramids equals ancient mystery. Scarabs equals transformation. Ankhs equals life. Desert equals timelessness. God's power systems. This is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It is a reduction of a once deeply integrated worldview into a set of recognizable symbols. However, something interesting happens alongside this simplification. A counter-movement emerges. Academic, archaeological, and cultural projects begin reconstructing Egyptian mythology with increasing precision. Digital humanities tools allow scholars to map relationships between gods, texts, and regions in ways previously impossible. Instead of flattening mythology, these tools reveal its internal diversity more clearly. We now see Egyptian mythology not as a single narrative, but as a vast interconnected network of traditions evolving over millennia. And this network model changes interpretation again, because it shows that Egyptian mythology was never meant to be static. It was meant to be adaptive, responsive, layered. At the same time, modern storytelling continues to reinterpret Egyptian mythology in increasingly abstract ways. It becomes metaphor for political systems, psychological structures, existential cycles, ecological balance, technological transformation. In this sense, Egyptian mythology becomes less about Egypt specifically, and more about how humans structure meaning under conditions of uncertainty. But even this modern abstraction has roots in the original system, because ancient Egyptian thought was already deeply concerned with uncertainty. Will the sun rise again? Will the Nile flood? Will order hold against chaos? Will identity survive death? The mythology was a way of stabilizing uncertainty into narrative form. And that function remains intact even in modern reinterpretation. At the same time, Egypt itself continues to engage with its ancient heritage in a living cultural context. Ancient sites are preserved not only as historical artifacts, but as national symbols. They exist simultaneously as archaeological evidence, cultural identity markers, tourist landmarks, sources of artistic inspiration. This layered identity mirrors the mythology itself, multiple meanings coexisting in the same structure. And so Egypt continues to embody its own mythological legacy, even in modern form. But as digital reconstruction accelerates, a final shift begins to emerge. Egyptian mythology is no longer only something we study. It is something we simulate, rebuild, recreate, and reinterpret continuously, which leads to an important realization. We are no longer recovering a single true Egyptian mythology. We are participating in its ongoing recreation. Every reconstruction is an interpretation. Every visualization is a model. Every narrative adaptation is a new layer added to an ancient system that never truly stopped evolving. And in that sense, Egyptian mythology has not ended. It has become recursive, a system that generates new versions of itself whenever it is retold, which brings the entire journey back to its original principle: order emerging from chaos. Because even now, thousands of years after the last temple rituals fell silent, Egyptian mythology continues to reorganize itself inside human imagination. At the far edge of Egyptian mythology's long journey, something becomes clear that was not obvious at the beginning. It never had a true ending point, not because it survived intact in its original form, but because it continuously re-enters human culture in new shapes. Each era does not simply receive Egyptian mythology. It reconstructs it, reinterprets it, and in doing so becomes part of it. This is the final paradox of Egyptian mythology. It is both the most ancient of myth systems and one of the most continuously modernized. A mythology that refuses to stay finished. Even after the temples closed, even after the last priesthoods dissolved, even after the language of hieroglyphs fell silent for centuries, Egyptian mythology persisted not as worship, but as structure waiting to be reactivated. And every time it is revisited, it reorganizes itself around the questions of that era. In the ancient world, it answered survival, kingship, death, and cosmic order. In the classical world, it became philosophy and comparative religion. In the modern era, it became archaeology, symbolism, and psychological archetype. In the digital age, it becomes simulation, narrative design, and interactive mythmaking. But across all these transformations, certain core patterns remain stable. Not the gods themselves as fixed personalities, but the relationships between forces they represent. Order and chaos, life and death, light and darkness, memory and oblivion, authority and disruption, creation and dissolution. These tensions are not uniquely Egyptian, but Egyptian mythology organizes them with unusual structural clarity. It does not resolve them permanently. It holds them in balance. This is where the concept of Ma'at continues to matter even outside its original religious framework. Ma'at is not just truth or justice in a moral sense. It is equilibrium across systems that are inherently unstable. It is the idea that reality functions only when opposing forces remain in dynamic balance. And when that balance fails, everything begins to unravel. This is why Egyptian mythology is so often reinterpreted in modern contexts involving systems thinking. Because it is fundamentally about systems, not isolated stories, but interdependent structures. The sun god must complete his journey daily, or darkness wins. The dead must pass judgment, or identity dissolves. The king must embody Horus, or legitimacy collapses. Chaos must exist, but be contained, or order becomes rigid and lifeless. Nothing in Egyptian mythology exists alone. Everything is relational. And that relational structure is what allows it to survive reinterpretation across millennia. Even when individual gods are removed from their original contexts, the system they belong to remains intelligible. Which is why Egyptian mythology continues to appear in unexpected places. In psychology, as archetypal systems of identity. In literature, as frameworks of transformation and rebirth. In political theory, as metaphors for order and legitimacy. In art, as symbolic language for power and mortality. In technology, as models for cyclical and rule-based systems. It becomes less a belief system and more a grammar of meaning, a way of organizing experience into recognizable patterns. But there is another layer to its persistence. Egyptian mythology is one of the few ancient systems that remains visually immediate. Its symbols were always designed for durability. Monumental architecture, carved stone inscriptions, stylized divine imagery, repetitive ritual motifs. This visual stability allows it to be instantly recognizable even when context is lost. A pyramid still reads as ancient structure of meaning. A solar disk still reads as cosmic power. A weighing scale still reads as judgment. This visual persistence is part of why it survives so effectively in global culture. But beneath the imagery, something deeper persists. The sense that reality itself is structured like a story that repeats. Ra's daily cycle is not just myth, it is repetition as principle. Osiris is not just a god, it is transformation through fragmentation and reassembly. Horus is not just a ruler, it is legitimacy emerging from conflict. Set is not just chaos, it is necessary disruption within stability. These are not characters in a narrative. They are roles within a system that continues to reassert itself wherever it is retold. And this is why Egyptian mythology does not feel finished, even now. Because it is not a closed narrative. It is a modular one. It can be broken apart and reassembled without losing coherence. Which means every generation that encounters it effectively becomes another layer of its evolution. Ancient Egyptians built temples and rituals. Later cultures built interpretations. Modern cultures build simulations. And future cultures will likely build entirely new forms of engagement that do not yet exist. But all of them will still be interacting with the same underlying structure. A world where order must be maintained against chaos, not once, but continuously. And that brings the story back to its original cosmic image. Before gods, before kings, before judgment, before temples, there was only the boundless waters of none. And from that formless expanse, structure emerged. Not permanently, but repeatedly. Because Egyptian mythology was never about final creation. It was about ongoing creation. Not a beginning that ended, but a beginning that continues. Even now, even here, in every reinterpretation, in every retelling, in every reconstruction of its symbols and meanings, Egyptian mythology is still doing what it has always done, turning chaos into order, and then asking what happens when order must be maintained again.